You're standing on the Arctic sea ice in February. The temperature is minus 42 degrees Celsius. Wind is screaming across the frozen ocean at 85 kilometers per hour, driving the wind chill to minus 68 degrees Celsius. Cold so extreme that your exhaled breath doesn't just freeze into fog, it crystallizes into ice particles that make a sound like breaking glass when they hit the ground. Cold where any exposed skin freezes solid in under 45 seconds. Cold where your eyelashes freeze together if you blink too slowly. Cold where the moisture in your nostrils freezes with each breath and the air itself burns your lungs. Cold that kills. The sun hasn't risen above the horizon in 6 weeks and won't for another 6. You're standing in 24-hour darkness broken only by moonlight reflecting off endless ice. The nearest settlement is 150 kilometers away. The nearest hospital is 400 kilometers away. There is no road. No rescue helicopter. No emergency services of any kind. You're completely alone on a frozen ocean that extends in every direction beyond the limits of vision. And you have 3 hours before the temperature drops another 10 degrees and the wind picks up to speeds that will make survival impossible even with perfect shelter. In those 3 hours you need to build a house. Not set up a tent. Not make a temporary lean-to. Build an actual house with walls, a roof, a door and interior space large enough for your family. A house that will keep you warm enough to sleep through the night when it's minus 50 degrees Celsius outside. A house built from the only material available on the frozen sea ice, snow. Here's what makes this seem impossible. You're going to build this house by cutting blocks from the ground you're standing on and stacking them into a dome. You're using frozen water to protect yourself from freezing to death. You're building with a material that is itself at minus 40 degrees Celsius and that conducts cold. And somehow this structure, when built correctly, will maintain interior temperatures 40 to 50 degrees warmer than outside. It will be so thermally effective that a single candle can warm it. So structurally sound that it can support the weight of a polar bear walking across its roof. So precisely engineered that the Inuit people survived for thousands of years using these snow houses in the most hostile environment humans have ever permanently inhabited. How is this possible? How do you build a warm house from frozen blocks of the same material that's trying to kill you? How does something constructed in 3 hours from compacted snow outperform modern tents costing thousands of dollars? The answer reveals physics that most people don't understand, engineering that seems to defy logic, and construction techniques so precise that modern architects study them to understand principles they missed. Before we reveal exactly how Inuit built igloos to survive minus 40 degrees Celsius Arctic winters and why this frozen architecture works when everything about it seems impossible, drop a comment with where you're watching from. And if stories of survival engineering that defies expectations fascinate you, hit that subscribe button because what you're about to learn will change forever how you think about snow, about shelter, and about what humans can build when knowledge is the only tool available. The Arctic environment where igloos were built presented survival challenges that compounded into conditions at the absolute edge of what humans can endure. Winter temperatures in the Canadian Arctic, northern Alaska and Greenland regularly dropped to minus 35 degrees Celsius to minus 45 degrees Celsius, with some locations experiencing minus 50 degrees Celsius or colder during the worst periods. These weren't brief cold snaps. These were sustained conditions lasting 5 to 6 months where the temperature never rose above minus 20 degrees Celsius even during the warmest part of the day. The darkness was total. Above the Arctic Circle, winter brings continuous night that lasts weeks or months depending on latitude. Even south of the Arctic Circle, Arctic winter days are measured in minutes of twilight rather than hours of daylight. This continuous darkness meant no solar heating whatsoever, no passive warmth from sunlight, no ability to use the sun to warm your body or your shelter. The wind on the sea ice and open tundra was constant and merciless. With no terrain features to break it and no vegetation to slow it, wind accelerated across the frozen landscape reaching 70 to 100 kilometers per hour during storms. Wind at minus 40 degrees Celsius isn't just uncomfortable. It's a heat extraction mechanism that can kill an adequately clothed person in under an hour if they're not in shelter. The building materials were limited to what the Arctic provided: snow and ice. There was no wood except occasional driftwood. No vegetation suitable for construction. No earth that could be excavated because the ground was frozen solid to depths of hundreds of meters. The only abundant material was snow, billions of tons of it covering the landscape in layers that could reach several meters deep. The mobility requirement made everything more challenging. Inuit peoples were nomadic hunters following seal, caribou, and other game across vast distances. They couldn't build permanent structures and return to them. They needed shelter that could be built wherever they found themselves when conditions became too severe to continue traveling. The igloo had to be something that could be constructed in a few hours using nothing but the snow underfoot and a bone or ivory snow knife. The igloo that the Inuit developed to address all these constraints wasn't a pile of snow or a hollowed-out snow drift. It was precision architecture with specific geometries, material properties, and construction sequences that had to be executed correctly or the structure would fail catastrophically. The construction started with snow selection, and not just any snow would work. The ideal snow for igloo building was wind-packed snow that had been compressed by wind into a dense, uniform layer. This snow had specific characteristics. It was hard enough to stand on without breaking through, dense enough to cut into blocks that wouldn't crumble, and uniform enough that blocks cut from it had consistent strength. The Inuit could read snow conditions the way modern engineers read material specifications. They would probe the snow with a rod or knife, feeling for the depth where wind packing had created the right density. Too soft and the blocks would compress and collapse under their own weight. Too hard and they couldn't be cut and shaped. The ideal density was roughly 300 to 400 kg/m superscript 3, about 1/3 the density of ice but 3 to 4 times the density of fresh snow. This specific density range created snow with remarkable properties. It was strong enough to be structural, blocks could support substantial weight without crushing. It was workable enough to be cut and shaped with simple tools. And critically, it had thermal properties that made it functional as insulation despite being made from frozen water. The site selection for the igloo mattered enormously even though the structure would only stand for days or weeks. Inuit builders looked for snow of the right depth and density, but also for locations with some protection from the worst wind. Even a small ridge or pressure ice formation that blocked wind from one direction could reduce heating requirements significantly. The igloo floor was excavated slightly below the surrounding snow surface, creating a pit perhaps 30 to 40 centimeters deep. This pit served multiple critical functions. It created a cold trap where the densest, coldest air would settle below the living level. It reduced the igloo's profile against the wind. And it provided blocks for the construction from material that was already at the optimal depth where wind packing had created the right density. The first ring of blocks was placed around the perimeter of the excavated floor. These blocks were typically 60 to 90 centimeters long, 40 to 50 centimeters high, and 15 to 20 centimeters thick. They were positioned with a slight inward lean, perhaps 10 to 15 degrees from vertical, beginning the dome curvature that would eventually close at the top. But here's the critical innovation that made igloo construction possible for a single person working alone: the spiral. Instead of building in horizontal rings that would require the builder to complete each ring before starting the next, the Inuit cut the first ring on an upward spiral. After placing the initial blocks in a circle, the builder would cut diagonally across several blocks, creating a ramp that spiraled upward. This spiral meant the builder could continuously add blocks in an ascending pattern, each new block resting against the block below and beside it, creating a self-supporting structure that grew upward and inward simultaneously. The builder worked from inside, cutting and placing blocks while standing in the center of the growing dome. Each block was cut and shaped to fit its specific position. The blocks weren't uniform rectangles. They were trapezoids with careful angles that had to match the dome's curvature at that point in the structure. The builder would cut a block from the snow floor, carry it to position, test the fit, trim it with the snow knife until it seated perfectly, then move to the next block. The precision required was extraordinary. A block that didn't fit correctly would leave a gap that allowed cold air infiltration or would create a stress point where the structure could fail. The dome's geometry required each block to lean inward at an angle that increased as the dome rose, eventually reaching nearly horizontal at the top. The angles weren't calculated mathematically. The Inuit builders had no formal geometry education. But through generations of practice, they had developed an intuitive understanding of the catenary curve that creates a dome strong enough to be self-supporting. They knew by eye and experience what angle each block needed to lean, what shape it needed to be, where it needed to contact adjacent blocks. The key block was placed at the top when the spiral had risen to close the dome. This final block was cut in a circle or polygon that exactly filled the remaining opening. It was lowered through the hole from outside, then pulled upward from inside to wedge into place, creating the keystone that locked the entire structure into compression. Once the dome was complete, the builder cut an entrance, not a simple doorway but an engineered passage that prevented heat loss. The entry was cut as a tunnel that descended below the igloo floor level before turning upward into the living space. This created a cold trap where heavy, cold air from outside would sink and pool in the tunnel rather than flowing into the igloo. The entry tunnel was typically 1 to 2 meters long and just large enough to crawl through. The low, narrow profile minimized the opening size, while the descending then ascending path created a thermal barrier that was as effective as a modern airlock. The completed igloo structure was a dome typically 3 to 4 meters in diameter at the base and 2 to 2.5 meters high at the peak. The walls were 15 to 20 centimeters thick of compressed snow with that critical density of 300 to 400 kg/m superscript 3. And now the physics that makes the igloo work becomes apparent. Physics that seems counterintuitive until you understand what's actually happening. Snow at the right density is roughly 50 to 60% air by volume. Those air pockets trapped in the ice crystal matrix are what create insulation. Air is an excellent insulator when it can't move through convection, and the ice crystals prevent air movement while taking up minimal space. The thermal conductivity of properly packed snow is approximately 0.05 to 0.15 W/m², about the same as fiberglass insulation and better than many modern building materials. A 20 centimeter thick igloo wall provides roughly R7 to R10 insulation value. That's not as good as a modern insulated wall, but it's far better than a tent fabric, and it's achieved using a material that's at -40 degrees Celsius to begin with. The snow blocks don't need to warm up to provide insulation. They insulate at their frozen temperature. But the igloo's thermal performance comes from more than just insulation thickness. The dome shape is critical for reasons beyond structural efficiency. A dome has the minimum surface area for the volume it encloses, which means minimum heat loss per unit of interior space. A rectangular structure of the same volume would have 20 to 30% more surface area through which heat could escape. The curved surfaces also prevent air from pooling in corners where it would create cold spots. The dome creates natural convection patterns where warm air rises to the center peak and cooler air descends along the walls, creating circulation that distributes heat evenly throughout the space. Once the structure was complete, the builder would often light a small fire or lamp inside and allow the interior surface to melt slightly. This created a thin glaze of ice on the interior walls as the melted snow refroze. This ice layer served multiple purposes. It sealed any small cracks or gaps between blocks, it created a smooth interior surface that reflected heat back into the space, and it made the structure more weather-resistant by creating a windproof shell. The ventilation hole at the dome's peak was small, perhaps 5 to 10 centimeters in diameter, but essential. It allowed moisture and any combustion gases to escape while being small enough that heat loss was minimal. The hole could be partially blocked with a loose snow plug if exterior conditions became too severe, reducing heat loss while maintaining minimum safe ventilation. The heating system inside an igloo was remarkably minimal, and this is where the thermal efficiency becomes most impressive. The primary heat source was often just a cullic, a soapstone lamp burning seal oil with a wick made from moss or cotton grass. This produced a flame perhaps 10 to 15 centimeters long and generated maybe 100 to 200 watts of heat. That's less heat output than 2 incandescent light bulbs. Yet this modest flame could raise the interior temperature of an igloo from -40 degrees Celsius exterior to 0 degrees Celsius to +5 degrees Celsius interior, a 40 to 45 degree temperature increase using less energy than a modern space heater would consume. The seal oil lamp wasn't just heating air. The soapstone bowl absorbed heat from the flame and became a radiant heater. The warm stone radiated infrared energy throughout the igloo, warming surfaces and people directly rather than just heating air that would then try to escape through the ventilation hole. Body heat was the other major heat source. A human at rest produces roughly 100 watts of metabolic heat. A family of 4 sleeping together generated 400 watts continuously just from their metabolism. Combined with the 100 to 200 watts from the lamp, that's 500 to 600 watts of heat input, maintaining a 40-degree temperature differential in a space roughly 20 to 25 cubic meters in volume. The sleeping platform inside the igloo was engineered as carefully as the structure itself. A raised platform was built from snow blocks, creating a sleeping surface 40 to 60 centimeters above the floor level. This elevation was critical because cold air settles at the lowest point due to density differences. The temperature stratification inside an igloo could be dramatic. At floor level where cold air pooled, temperature might be -15 degrees Celsius. At sleeping platform height, it might be 0 degrees Celsius to plus 5 degrees Celsius. At head height when sitting on the platform, it could reach plus 10 degrees Celsius. That's a 25-degree temperature range within the small interior space, all driven by natural convection and density differences. The platform surface was covered with insulation that prevented sleepers from losing heat to the snow beneath them. Layers of caribou hide, fur side up, created a sleeping surface where hollow caribou hairs trapped air. Arctic willows or dried grasses under the hides added thickness. The total insulation could reach 8 to 12 centimeters, creating a barrier that prevented conductive heat loss into the frozen platform. The bedding that covered sleeping people was massive by modern standards. Caribou skin sleeping robes with fur intact were layered several deep, creating coverings that could weigh 15 to 20 kilograms and provide insulation thickness of 15 to 20 centimeters. These weren't sleeping bags in the modern sense but rather large fur blankets that covered the entire family sleeping together. The sleeping arrangement was intimate and calculated. The family slept in a tight cluster, bodies pressed together, sharing collective warmth. Children slept between adults to benefit from heat radiating from both sides. The positioning maximized thermal efficiency by eliminating air gaps between people where heat could escape. Clothing worn during sleep was extensive. No one undressed because the clothing was already warm from body heat accumulated during the day. Additional layers were added for sleep, extra caribou skin garments, additional fur wrappings for extremities. The goal was trapping body heat in multiple nested layers that created a microclimate around each person's body. The head was wrapped completely except for a breathing hole, because head heat loss is disproportionate due to high blood flow to the brain. Hands were drawn inside clothing and pressed against the torso. Feet were wrapped in additional furs and positioned inside the sleeping robes where they could benefit from the collective warmth. Inside this complete system, the insulated igloo, the modest heating source, the raised platform, the thick bedding, the clustered sleeping arrangement, the extensive clothing, temperatures in the sleeping microclimate could reach 15 to 20 degrees Celsius even when it was minus 45 degrees Celsius outside. That's a 60 to 65 degree differential maintained with nothing but snow blocks, seal oil, caribou fur, and body heat. The overnight management required the same vigilance that all Arctic survival demanded. One person remained partially alert, monitoring the lamp to ensure it maintained adequate flame without smoking excessively or burning so hot it melted the interior ice glaze. They checked that the ventilation hole hadn't become blocked by frost buildup or drifting snow. They verified that everyone remained adequately covered. The moisture management inside the igloo was as critical as heat management. Breathing, cooking, and any moisture from bodies created humidity that in minus 40 degrees Celsius conditions wanted to condense and freeze on the coldest surfaces. If this happened uncontrolled on the interior walls, it would build up frost layers that reduced insulation effectiveness and could eventually damage the structure. The Inuit managed this through the ice glaze technique mentioned earlier combined with careful ventilation. The interior ice surface was cold enough that moisture didn't condense there preferentially. The ventilation hole allowed moisture-laden air to escape continuously. The result was interior humidity that remained low enough to prevent problematic frost buildup while maintaining enough moisture for comfortable breathing. The food preparation inside the igloo used the seal oil lamp for cooking as well as heating. A soapstone or metal pot positioned over the lamp could melt snow for water or cook food. Using the same heat source for multiple purposes maximized efficiency with the limited fuel available. The diet that sustained people through Arctic winter was almost entirely meat and fat from hunted animals. Seal meat and blubber, caribou when available, fish caught through ice, polar bear occasionally, walrus in some regions, all providing the extraordinary caloric density required for Arctic survival. The human body in minus 40 degrees Celsius conditions burns 4,500 to 5,500 calories per day for basic survival and minimal activity. This energy came almost entirely from fat and protein. The blubber from marine mammals was particularly critical because it provided concentrated calories in small volume, essential when every item had to be transported by dog sled or carried by hand. Eating practices adapted to the conditions. Meat was often eaten frozen or barely thawed because cooking required precious fuel. Frozen meat could be sliced thin and allowed to warm slightly in the mouth before swallowing. This wasn't preference. It was fuel conservation that made long-term survival possible. The social organization inside the igloo during periods of confinement reflected both space constraints and thermal realities. Everyone had defined positions and roles. The lamp tender, typically an adult woman, managed the kuluk, controlling flame height, adding oil, trimming the wick, ensuring safe and efficient operation. The hunters, typically men, maintained gear, sharpened tools, prepared hunting equipment, and ventured outside when weather permitted to hunt seals or other game. Children learned survival skills through observation and carefully supervised participation. Elders contributed through storytelling that transmitted cultural knowledge and through teaching that passed survival techniques to the next generation. The igloo as a temporary shelter typically lasted days to weeks before the family moved on to follow game. But the structure's durability was impressive. A well-built igloo could withstand Arctic storms with wind gusts exceeding 150 kilometers per hour. The dome shape deflected wind with minimal resistance. The compressed snow blocks could support enormous loads. Polar bears could walk across igloo roofs without causing collapse. When the family needed to move, the igloo was simply abandoned. It would eventually collapse from wind erosion or temperature cycling, but in the meantime it might provide emergency shelter for other travelers. Some igloos in heavily traveled areas were maintained and reused by multiple families over an entire season. The construction time for a skilled builder was remarkable. An experienced Inuit could build a survival igloo, a simple dome large enough for 1 or 2 people, in under an hour working alone. A family igloo housing 4 to 6 people could be built in 2 to 3 hours by 1 or 2 people working together. Larger communal igloos housing 15 to 20 people required 4 to 6 hours with multiple builders but created substantial shared living space. This speed of construction was critical for survival. When a storm approached or when darkness fell, shelter had to be built quickly. The ability to create a thermally effective structure in a few hours using only the snow underfoot and a cutting tool meant the difference between survival and death. The knowledge required to build a functional igloo couldn't be learned from instructions or books. It had to be developed through years of practice starting in childhood. Children watched parents build igloos from their earliest memories. They helped by carrying blocks. They practiced on small structures. They learned to read snow conditions, to judge angles, to understand when a block fit correctly and when it needed more trimming. By the time a young adult was responsible for building shelter for their own family, they had 15 to 20 years of accumulated experience. They knew by feel what density snow needed to be. They knew by eye what angle each block should lean. They knew by sound whether a block was seated correctly. This embodied knowledge was transmitted entirely through direct participation and observation. When modern researchers study igloos using thermal imaging and precise temperature measurements, they consistently find that traditional designs perform exactly as historical accounts describe. Interior temperatures 40 to 50 degrees Celsius warmer than exterior. Minimal fuel consumption maintaining livable conditions. Structural integrity under extreme loads. The physics works exactly as the Inuit understood it through empirical observation. But the researchers also find that building a functional igloo requires skills that take years to develop. The angle calculations, the block fitting, the dome geometry, these aren't things modern people can do correctly on their first attempt even with instructions. The knowledge is embedded in practice developed through thousands of repetitions. The igloo represents one of humanity's most elegant solutions to an extreme survival challenge. Building material that's literally frozen water. Construction time measured in hours. Thermal performance that rivals modern insulated structures. Structural strength supporting massive loads. All achieved with no tools beyond a knife, no materials beyond snow, no energy beyond human labor. The complete survival system worked because every element addressed specific mechanisms by which Arctic cold killed people. The dome shape minimized heat loss per volume. The wall thickness provided adequate insulation. The raised platform eliminated cold floor air. The entry tunnel prevented warm air escape. The lamp provided minimal but adequate heat. The bedding trapped body warmth. The clothing created portable insulation. The food fueled metabolic heat generation. Remove any element and survival became exponentially harder. An igloo without the entry tunnel would lose heat too rapidly. Perfect shelter without adequate bedding would mean hypothermia overnight. The best structure and bedding without sufficient food would mean inadequate metabolic heat. Every element had to work together as an integrated system. That's how Inuit built igloos to survive -40 degrees Celsius Arctic winters. Through precise understanding of snow properties and dome geometry. Through construction techniques refined over thousands of years. Through thermal management that maximized efficiency with minimal resources. Through sleeping systems that accumulated body heat. Through clothing that prevented heat loss. Through knowledge transmitted across generations where excellence was survival's only option. The Inuit lived successfully in the Arctic for 4,000 years using these snow houses. They raised healthy families, developed complex cultures, created sophisticated art and tools, built thriving societies, all while living part of each year in structures built from frozen water. They did it through knowledge that was accurate without modern physics, through engineering that was effective without equations, through skills developed over lifetimes where each winter was another test of whether understanding was adequate or fatal.